Good evening and welcome to Conversations Live. Get your garden on. I'm Bill Hallman. It's fall. That means it's time to think about what worked in your garden this season and where you could have used a little expert advice. Tonight, our guests discuss the growing season, plus we'll get their postseason to-do lists. They'll also take your questions. Now let's meet our guests. Tom Butzler is a Penn State Extension horticulture educator. He works with commercial horticulture operations and the landscaping community in Clinton County. His area of expertise is vegetable production and beekeeping. John Esslinger is a county-based extension educator with Penn State Extension. He works with fruit and vegetable growers and in greenhouse production. Justin Wheeler is a member of Penn State Extension's Master Gardener program. He's also a communications specialist for the xerces Society, a nonprofit environmental organization that focuses on the conservation of invertebrates considered to be essential for biological diversity and ecosystem health. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And you can join tonight's conversation. Our toll-free number is 1-800-543-8242, and our email address is connect@wpsu.org. You may also tweet us your questions or comment using the hashtag WPSUconversations. All right, gentlemen, thanks again for being here. A lot of people will be tuning in tonight to look ahead to the spring, but let's take a look back at the growing season that was. We'll start with you, Tom. Anything stand out to you in this past growing season?
You know, Bill, there's not a normal growing season here in Pennsylvania. If you looked at the growing season last year, it was hot and dry, at least in the center part of the state. And this year, you know, we had plenty of moisture, especially early on. It did tail off towards the end. So, you know, a lot of moisture, plants grew real well. My neck of the woods, the biggest problem we had was on cucumbers. Downy mildew came in and it did a pretty good number on home garden cucumbers, but also for some of the growers that are growing them for the auctions and roadside stands. So that was somewhat problematic.
And John, how about your thoughts?
In our area, we had a lot of heavy rains, and sometimes the heavy rains caused some problems. There was probably more root diseases this year than we normally see. But overall, gardens did well. The biggest complaint I think I heard on gardens was the weeds are growing too well.
Yeah.
So.
And Justin, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, here in Center County, we had plenty of cool, wet weather as well, and I think that kind of delayed things. I know tomatoes kind of didn't want to set fruit, and then they kind of set it all at once. And then with the ongoing rain, there was a lot of cracking and a lot of disease for those crops. So I think it was a tough season in some ways and easy if you're growing weeds and wildflowers.
You brought up the cool, wet weather, but what about the warmth when it comes to the fall? We had an 81-degree day in October already, a stretch of 6 days where we had the average was at least 12 degrees above the normal for that time of year. Is a warm start to the fall something that anybody should be concerned about, or what does that mean for gardening?
For gardening, I mean, most of the gardens are kind of running their course. It does extend the season a little bit. I mean, people were picking tomatoes well into the fall, so that was really nice. Now, I do know tonight or in the next couple of nights, they're calling for some really hard, cold freezes. So that will probably put an end to most of the gardening, except for things that maybe some lettuce and radishes, things like that. So it's nice that it extends the season. I think the one problem you have is that for some of our woody ornamentals, that kind of keep time with the seasons. This long growing season, if it continues year after year and extends further and further, there might be some problems with that. In hardening off, just getting ready for some of the weather that will be coming up.
And you mentioned the first frost coming up here. Is there anything that people should be doing to prepare for that?
Well, yeah, a lot of home gardeners to extend the season even further is when we get this cold weather, they'll prepare for it the night before. They'll put something over their sensitive plants, and that will get them through the next maybe several days or a week or two. Usually we get a frost, and then afterwards it's warm for a couple weeks or several days. So they can extend that growing season a little further. But the key is to cover some of those sensitive plants, like tomatoes and our warm season crops. You wouldn't have to do that with beets. I mentioned radishes, lettuce.
John, what about the fruit trees? You brought in some apples. Any advice for people who still are most of the apples off the trees already?
Yeah, most everything is harvested. If you do have some late varieties, A frost does not hurt the apples. You have to get down into the mid-20s, 25, 26, before the apples start to become damaged. So if you do have a late variety that because of the cool season maybe wasn't quite fully mature, you do have some time yet. The frost tonight is not going to any serious damage on them.
We're going to talk about insects a little bit more this evening, but I read an alarming report. It was out of Germany, I think, where there was an alarming drop in the insect population. What's the insect population like here in Pennsylvania, especially for perhaps some species that we don't want around and even species that we do? We'll go to you, Justin.
Well, I think that study was showing a large drop in biodiversity that was pretty alarming. It was a very long study. The way the study was set up, they were catching mostly flying insects, but other studies have been conducted here in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere have been seeing a huge drop in general biodiversity. I think for us here in the States, one of our biggest concerns is loss of pollinating species. Bumblebees in particular, 28% are at risk of extinction in North America. And you had the rusty patch bumblebee being the first bee to be listed as endangered. So it is certainly alarming. Pest insects, common insects, we know less about them because they're less studied. Pests are obviously studied more because they're a threat to agricultural systems, but even common butterflies and common insects may be declining.
What about the overall health of the pollinators? You mentioned the bumblebees. What about here in Pennsylvania? Was there any concern about them?
Well, I know in Pennsylvania, across the country, it's a concern. The rusty patch bumblebee used to be a very common pollinator in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, and it's found in very small clusters around the Great Lakes. So it's one whose range has really seriously contracted. I know Penn State's worked very seriously on a pollinator protection plan to be adopted at the state level. So I think it's a concern for everybody in every state, and I'm glad to see Pennsylvania is really moving forward with some protections.
And John, you brought in some insects today. What did you want to talk about?
Okay, couple of things that it's common we run into is the brown marmorated stink bug. It's an insect that causes a lot of damage in the garden, primarily tomatoes, peppers, and sweet corn are the main crops. It also feeds on tree fruit, typically the ones later in the season. It works uniquely in that it basically has a feeding apparatus that it punctures the skin and then feeds on the tissue beneath it. So you'll just see a spot on the outside, but when you peel the tomato or the apple, you'll see the area where they've been feeding.
And so this is a picture of the damage right there. So
yeah, those spots towards the bottom of that apple are from the brown marmorated stink bug feeding. You can peel that back, and that damaged tissue will go in about 1/4 of an inch. It'll be kind of brownish underneath there. That apple can still be used. I mean, you just want to cut that area out, but other than that, the apple can be used.
Is this pretty common damage? How widespread does this become in a crop?
This was a good year for the brown marmorated stink bug. Our entomologists were telling us back in the spring that they saw an unusually high number that overwintered because they assumed because of the mild winter. And we were seeing quite a bit of damage in gardens and small orchards. I did want to mention another insect, the squash bug. And the squash bug is a relative to the stink bug, but it only goes after your squash plant. So often you'll hear people say, well, the stink bugs killed my zucchini plant. Well, it wasn't the stink bugs, it's actually the squash bug.
Okay. And Tom, last year you showed us something when you were here called the spotted lanternfly. It's an invasive species that was just discovered in Pennsylvania. You've actually observed it. What's the concern?
Yeah, I went down to a training session down in the southeastern part of the state, and the spotted lanternfly is relatively new to Pennsylvania. It was back in 2015, I think. It's found nowhere else in the Western Hemisphere, so it came over somehow from the Asian area, probably trade, and there's great concern with this. It's an aggressive feeder, and what it does is it sticks its feeding tube into the host tissue, woody plants, and extracts the carbohydrates or sugars from the plants, and it uses part of that to survive. but it doesn't fully digest or utilize all those sugars, and so it deposits, or some of that sugar product comes out of the waste, and it coats everything underneath them with this, what we call honeydew. So everything underneath where they're feeding gets really sticky, and they're massing in very large numbers in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania. We had a landscaper come in and talk about some of his interactions with his clients. And he said that his clients, this one place, one yard that had a very large tree that was heavily infested with the spotted lanternfly, they had to wear raincoats to go out into the yard. It was raining down this honeydew, this sticky substance on everything. And so for them to get out in their yard to prevent from getting covered with the honeydew, they had to put on some cover.
So that's obviously a nuisance. You don't want bug waste dripping all over you when you're walking outside in your own yard. But beyond that, what is the effect of these insects? What is it doing to native plants and other plants and gardens?
Right, so the host range on this spotted lanternfly is pretty large. So years ago, we had a new invasive come in, the emerald ash borer, and its host range was pretty specific. Ash trees. It wasn't going after oaks, it wasn't going after fruit trees and so forth. But this spotted lanternfly has a very large host range. Over in Korea, where it was a problem right before it came over to the United States, it has about 70, 75 plants that it feeds on. So it's going to feed on tree of heaven, Ailanthus, which is also an invasive tree. That's not native. That's one of its favorite foods. But it will feed on maples, it will feed on fruit trees, it will feed on grapes. So it has a wide host range. And it's of great concern, not just for our native plants, but for the agriculture industry. Down in the southeastern part of the state, there are a lot of grape growers, feeding some of the wineries and so forth. And this insect is getting in there, feeding on the plant and dropping that honeydew onto the grapes. And that's a product that can't be used in making wine, or it makes a wine that's not very pasty or good to drink. So there is a lot of concern of this getting out of this quarantined area of Pennsylvania and spreading throughout the rest of the state.
You mentioned the quarantine. So describe what's being done to keep this, or try to keep this insect in one location.
Right. Really, the big thing is education, to alert the general public, the urban communities, on what this insect is, what it can do, the life cycle, how to recognize what the adult is, what the nymphal stages are, and what the egg is like, the eggs masses are like. Because the female will lay her eggs on anything that is smooth. Yes, it could be tree bark, but it could be a side of a camper. It could be pavers. A landscaper might be storing pavers. And then these campers and these pavers or whatever that with the smooth surface and this egg mass on it will move outside the quarantine area. So really it's trying to educate the public on recognizing, identifying the insect at various stages, and then what you can do to maybe prevent that from becoming more of a problem outside your area.
Okay. We have our first caller tonight. We have Dick from Johnstown. Dick, what's your question?
Yes, I first have a comment. I'll direct this to the gentleman with the Nittany Lion logo. It might be a good omen for Saturday's game. But my question is the woolly, I think it's called the woolly algid, the hemlock pest. Has that been controlled? I haven't heard much about it lately. Thank you, gentlemen.
Sure. So what he's referring to is the hemlock woolly adelgid. That's another invasive insect that was introduced many, many years ago. It spreads relatively slowly, and its host is hemlocks. And it's slowly spreading from the western part of the state going eastward. And there's been a lot of research in trying to find methods to control the hemlock woolly adelgid. I mean, on large acreage, large settings, it's really difficult to control. It's much easier to control in a landscape setting where you need one or two trees to manage. They have been looking at some biologicals to control this. Some of their insects that attack the adelgid in their native country. They were looking at a tiny little lady beetle. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it has a common name or not, but they were looking at mass rearing it, seeing if it could survive out in the wild, reproduce, and target that hemlock woolly adelgid population. But I haven't heard anything or read anything where it's really knocking out the hemlock woolly adelgid. So they're still working on it as far as I know.
Yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking. I mean, I've yet to find a hemlock in the landscape around here in State College that hasn't had woolly adelgid. We have 5 on our property that have it, and the hemlocks were going to have to come down because of it.
Right.
But there is a native predator that they're experimenting with out of the Pacific Northwest. They're trying it in the Catskills to see if that's going to control it. So there are some biologicals, but yeah, so far I haven't heard anything terribly encouraging about controlling it.
And the other thing with the hemlock, and there's another pest species that is targeting our hemlocks, and they're occurring at the same time, sometimes separately, but there's the hemlock elongate scale, and that's on the underside of the needles. It's not as showy as the hemlock woolly adelgid, but if you would turn the needles over, you can see the scale on the underside of the needles, and that is also doing some damage to the hemlocks. So it's kind of a double whammy on our native hemlock species.
All right, Dick, thank you for the question. What about the insects? John, you mentioned some species had a good year this year. Is there anything that people could be doing to their gardens, their lawns, to make sure that they don't have a good year next year?
Insects with diseases, there are some things. Insects, it's a little more difficult to try to prevent them from year to year. What would really help a lot is if we can get a good hard winter. We talked about the brown marmorated stink bug. They felt that the populations that survived last winter were higher than normal, and that's why we had such a problem. The squash bug, which I mentioned because they look so much like the stink bugs, their numbers were unusually high this past year, and that's probably also because of the the mild winter. So we're looking forward to a hard winter to try to mitigate some of those problems, keep them at a manageable level.
Justin, what about some of the insects that we want to keep around? Is there anything to do in the fall leading up to the winter, through the winter, to make sure that those type of pollinators or insects that you want in your garden stay there?
Yeah, one of the things that the Master Gardeners have been trying to get people to do now for a couple years is to be less aggressive with their garden cleanup. Try to actually leave a couple inches of leaf litter somewhere in your yard. Most butterflies and moths, unlike the monarch, they don't migrate for the winter. They actually live in the landscape as either an egg, a pupa, or a chrysalis, and they need that leaf litter for cover. Bumblebees at the end of the season, the mated queens, they actually nest just very shallowly in the surface, and that leaf litter gives them really important cover. So if you can take it off your lawn and make a nice pile somewhere in your yard, that's going to do a lot of good. And also not being as aggressive with cutting back perennials, because again, a lot of pollinators are going to use those for nesting for overwintering.
Okay. And we have another question. David from Oil City. David, what's your question?
Yes, I was wondering, with the rising tick population, if there's any thought or anything in development as far as an aerial application to control the rising tick population?
Yeah, I was on a hike this past weekend with a Boy Scout troop, and we had a couple of ticks on ourselves. So that's, anytime you venture outside, it's something you have to be aware of. But I do not know of any aerial type of control management method for ticks in our area. Really it should occur on a more a smaller scale in your yards. If you can create some sort of you have a forested area, and then you maintain like a little bit of a protection area, or isolate it from the yard. Those ticks don't like crossing a open, sunny, grassy area. So that would serve as a nice buffer. Maybe if it's of a concern around that buffer, the edge of the lawn, you can use an insecticide. But I don't know of anything widespread that they're trying to do with tick populations. I mean, some other insect species, yes, but I'm not aware of ticks.
Yeah, I don't know of any kind of foliar application that would even really work against ticks. But as you said, they can't take the heat. So if you give a nice wide buffer of 2 feet to 3 feet of either mulch or lawn between woody plants and the rest of your yard, that generally keeps them at bay. Another big problem that they're finding is that Japanese barberry, which is an invasive plant, is actually supporting the white-footed mouse, which is the actual vector for ticks. So it's been this ongoing problem of Japanese barberry escaping into the landscape, raising populations of white-footed mice, raising populations of ticks. A lot of research has been going into this. So, I would say remove barberry or don't plant it is one big thing you can do to help reduce the tick population.
All right, David, who sounds a lot like my brother. Thank you for your call, David. We have a tweet. Jen tweets, our wisteria is rotting off at the base. The plants are about 10 years old, and it started this summer. Ideas?
It'd be interesting if we could have a conversation with Jen. I mean, wisteria is usually pretty hardy. You know, you wonder if mulch application, sometimes we've seen it in the State College area here and some other communities where they're piling mulch up around the stem, almost creating what we call these mulch volcanoes. And stems of trees and shrubs are not really designed to be moist for those extended period of times. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, what I'm seeing around this area. I don't know. I can't really think of anything else.
Some other things maybe to look at is just, rain spouts, things like that. I mean, because we had such heavy rains this past summer, the conditions were very good for root rots. And when it rotted off at the base, that's what it made me think of, is that she's got a root rot problem. Possibly she could change some things in her landscape to try to divert that water away so that, that doesn't happen.
What about rains in the fall? We had a little less than usual in September, in State College anyway. We're a little above average now for October. Does a heavy rainfall in the autumn have anything to do with what you could see later on in the spring when it's time to plant again?
Sure. For our woody ornamentals, for our plants that are perennials that are going to go through the winter and then bloom in the spring or leaf out, they do have to harden off, and adequate soil moisture is critical to them getting ready for the winter and surviving the winter. So we don't want heavy rains, of course, but we want adequate rain so that they're not going into winter stressed out, because you can get some burning. It might not necessarily kill the plant, but it can cause some damage, long-term damage for the spring. So those rains are critical in the fall.
What about planting? We're pretty deep into October now. I think we usually do this show in September. Is it too late to get the garlic in the garden or bulbs planted for the flowers? Or is it right about time, John?
No, this is a good time. I mean, normally we would plant earlier than now, but we do have a new insect in Pennsylvania that's causing problems with anything in the allium family, like the onions, garlic, shallot. And if you plant early enough that you actually have the garlic emerge in the fall, then that attracts that allium leaf miner. I did bring a few from my garden, and just want to talk a little bit about when you're planting garlic, you always want to plant the largest cloves. To get a nice bulb, you've got to plant a nice clove. Basically, you want to take off those outside ones, use those to plant. And then those smaller ones on the inside, eat those. But this is a good time. I'm in the Bloomsburg area, and I've not planted my garlic yet. I think probably this weekend I'll plant it. And we're just because, it's been warm, and we're trying to avoid that garlic from coming up. The other thing that helps, slow down the garlic in the fall is mulching it. I've even used paper shredding, something that's white that reflects the light so it doesn't warm the soil as much. You just don't want that to come up this fall.
Is there concern about the soil drying out on top, or is that not much of a concern if you plant early and it dries out in October, say?
It would have to be very dry for it to hurt the garlic. I've never seen that. Never seen it.
So that's not a
enough.
problem.
Yeah.
Okay, that was what I was worried about. So.
Yeah. Okay.
We have an email. We are recent transplants to northwestern Pennsylvania to restore a historic building which came with an established bee colony living in an unused chimney that serviced a boiler. Is there any reason we should remove them? We would rather not for obvious reasons and keep honeybees we would rather not for obvious reasons and kept honeybees in Florida, but are not familiar with wild bees. Wild bees
is probably what she's saying. So they're probably still honeybees. I assume they're living in the chimney?
Maybe. I'd be a little suspicious. I want to make sure that they aren't some kind of wasp or, if they're a swarming insect, then they're either going to be a honeybee or they're going to be some kind of wasp. Most of the native bees are going to be solitary. They're not going to live in a chimney in a hive. You'd probably want to check that out. And I would say if they are honeybees and there's no reason to disturb them, then leave them alone, and eventually they're going to fly off and form a new colony elsewhere.
So what would bring them to a chimney? Honeybees. If they are honeybees, we'll take Adam at his word that that's exactly what it is. Is that something that's unusual that they would relocate to a chimney?
I mean, it can happen. So if somebody's keeping bees, and you guys could probably speak to this, if somebody's keeping bees, they have a tendency to occasionally divide the colony and swarm. And if there's nowhere for them to swarm to, no available hive or box, then they're going to fly off and they're going to find a cavity in a tree or a chimney from a historic boiler and set up residence. So they very well could be honeybees. It's just there are very few wild honey bee colonies left in the United States. So it's possible, but maybe unlikely. But all the more reason to leave them if it is honeybees.
Okay, well, thank you for the email, Adam. If you're just joining us, I'm Bill Hallman, and this is Conversations Live. Get your garden on WPSU. Our guests tonight are Penn State Extension educators Tom Butzler, John Esslinger, and Master Gardener Justin Wheeler. Our telephone number is 1-800-543-8242, and our panel is ready to take your phone calls. Or if you'd prefer to email us, our address is connect@wpsu.org. And we have two phone calls. We'll start with Ann from State College. Ann, what's your question?
Just a comment about moles in the lawn. I don't think it's voles, V-O-L-E-S, because the soil is raised up a little bit too high to be a really tiny little mousy thing. But what is the hazard and what is the cure? I Googled, said castor oil. What do you think about that?
Can you repeat that last sentence, or what was the question about? You said castor oil?
The question is about moles,
Right.
M-O-L-E, and is the remedy castor oil?
Yeah, I don't know about that method of controlling them. I mean, they're in the lawn because there's a food source there. They're going after grubs, and they'll eat other things too. So that one way to try to eliminate them is by eliminating their food source. I'm not familiar with castor oil. She said castor oil.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not familiar with that as a method of controlling moles.
I'm familiar with castor beans being used, and castor beans are toxic, so you want to be very careful if you do want to use them. I can't address how effective they are.
Yeah, I'd say you're exactly right. They're obviously there because they're going for a food source. So I think addressing that, maybe aerating the lawn really well to get rid of some of the Japanese grubs, or using some other sort of treatment is probably going to help out quite a bit. But I'm not familiar with using castor oil.
Okay, and did we have Ken on the line, or is that okay? So I planted my first container garden this season, and we talked briefly about that. Should I be doing anything to get my soil prepped in that garden for next year? What can I be doing to optimize my garden?
Well, as county extension educators, we really promote soil sampling. There's no way to look at a soil and say, okay, it needs potassium, it needs phosphorus. We need to have it tested. The soil tests are only $9. Not sure how big your garden is, but if it's a decent size and it's worthwhile, then get a test done, and that takes all the guesswork out of it. You'll know exactly where you're at. It'll give you recommendations on if you need lime, what kind of lime you need, how much lime to put on. It'll also give you recommendations for fertilizing for next year. And so, yeah, this is a good time. I mean, things are slow. You have time now. Get a soil test, find out where you're at, and then you'll be prepared for next year. The other consideration there is that lime takes time to react with the soil, and so the fall is a good time to get that soil tested, apply the lime, and give it time to react so that next spring it's ready to go and your plants are going to do well.
So for clueless gardeners like myself, or for those who haven't used the service before, give your service a shout out here. How can people contact the extension offices or find their extension offices to get these soil tests done?
Okay, there's an extension office in each county. We all have the soil test kits. Just come into the office. Like I said, they're $9. Our office can only take checks or cash, where we're not equipped to take a credit card, but there may be some offices that are. Inside the kit is the instructions on how to take your sample. There's a form that you'll fill out, indicates what crop you want to grow next year, so that the recommendations you're given are based on the crop that you're going to be growing. It's fairly easy to do. It's not rocket science. Yeah.
And then they're sent up to Penn State, their
Yeah.
soil testing facility.
Yeah, and it takes about 10 days and you'll get the response back.
All right. So check out your extension office. Come with cash.
Yep.
Okay. So we talked about the warm weather, and I've noticed some of the flower beds, gardens coming up with new green growth of weeds, maybe some wildflowers. Is that a concern? Is there anything people should be doing with these late growing green weeds?
Well, weeds can be classified a couple different ways. You have your annual weeds and you have your perennial weeds. And then with your annual weeds, which, they complete their life cycle in one growing season and then they're done, they die. You have your winter annuals and your summer annuals. So right now you have some of your winter annuals coming up. And so they've germinated and they're growing, and they'll kind of limp along through the winter, and then they'll die off in the spring after they set seed. So, I mean, it's just normal to see some green growth, especially with this moisture and temperatures that we have had.
And we do encourage gardeners to, like especially in a vegetable garden, to put in like a cover crop.
That's right.
And if you've not done a cover crop, those winter annual weeds are going to end up being your cover crop. And that's better than not having anything there. It's good to have something green and growing. So you kind of say, well, it'll be a weed next spring when you want to plant your vegetables, but right now it's not a problem.
What's a good example of a cover crop that people can be planting?
At this point in the season, we're pretty well limited to rye. Rye tends to grow better in colder weather. Earlier in October, wheat is also a good option. And I like wheat in the garden only because it doesn't grow as rapidly in the spring. Rye can really get ahead of you and actually become a problem because it grows so rapidly, where wheat's a little slower and a little easier to manage in the spring.
We have a comment in from email. It's from Kathy, and she wanted to talk about the hemlocks. It says, I wanted to say that I've used Bonide annual tree and shrub treatment with Systemax for several years to treat woolly algidid successfully, and have saved several hemlocks this way. Is this something any of you have
Yeah, I
heard?
mean, as we were talking about the hemlock woolly adelgid, there are a couple ways to treat. I mean, you could use a foliar spray, something as soft as insecticidal soaps or other insecticides, but there are these drenches and tree injections where the insecticide is applied near the roots as a drench, and the insecticide is taken up through the tree and it's distributed to all parts of the tree where the insects feed. Or there are these tree injections also, where a landscaping company can come in and inject the insecticide into the tree, gets into the phloem, basically the plumbing system of the tree, again distributes that throughout the whole canopy of the tree where the insects are feeding, and then as they're feeding, they take that insecticide into their body. So there are ways to control this hemlock woolly adelgid. But as Justin was saying, when you go out in some of these forested areas where there might be 10 acres of hemlocks, it's lining up the stream as you walk up the valley, that's not economical. You can't apply that, what she was saying, on every tree. It just becomes expensive. On a landscape setting, when you're treating 3, 4, 5 trees, that's a little more applicable and cost effective. But yeah, there are treatments for hemlock woolly adelgid. Yes.
Oh, we have another phone call. Let's go to Amber from State College. Amber, what's your question?
Hi. I had a raised bed built for myself this year, and I used it. I planted different vegetables in it and some squash. And about half of the plants ended up getting a really bad case of powdery mildew or something similar. I mean, I was assuming that's what it was. But I just ripped the plants out, but they were in there for a little while with it on. I didn't know if I need to replace the soil or, do anything for the outer edges to prevent it from happening next year. I don't know if that's something that lives through the next season or anything. Thanks.
John?
Yeah, no, it does. Well, powdery mildew is always around. It's a disease that has to have live tissue to live on. The fact that you had it this year really is not going to have a big impact on you having it next year. There's some things that you can do to manage it next year. One of the things, and this is kind of contrary to what you might hear as far as a lot of other diseases, but powdery mildew can be washed off, and so overhead irrigating is one way to keep powdery mildew under control. On the farms this year, powdery mildew was not a problem until we got into the drier periods later in the growing season. So all through June, July, when we were getting those heavy rains, powdery mildew was a no-show. Once the rain stopped, then it became a big problem. It's a disease that likes high humidity with no rain. And so, you might want to consider just, okay, next year I'm going to start using the hose, kind of keep it washed off once a week and just make that effort. But the fact that you had it this year, you're probably no more likely to have it next year.
Another call, we have Marianne. I'm sorry, is Marianne on the line? Marianne from Altoona? Marianne, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm here. I just wanted to bring up again, someone mentioned moles, M-O-L-E-S?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yes, moles with the bulbs. Okay, we didn't plant our bulbs yet either, and wanted to know, I think the warm weather is still going to be around long enough after the Halloween and we get that frost, but then we get some warm weather again, hopefully. But I wanted to ask about the moles.
Yeah, I'm not.
Because they're.
You're saying it's an issue with bulbs, and I'm not sure it's. Right. I'm not sure it's moles.
I wanted to ask you about what do I do about the moles? I don't really want to kill them.
Right. So I wonder if it truly is moles. Moles are mostly feeding on insects that are living in the soil. The big one, as Justin had mentioned earlier in the show, is the grubs, the Japanese beetle, the immature stage. And so, but they'll eat other things there. They're not really plant feeders. And so, around my house, when I've seen with some of the neighbors, the big issue around bulbs is chipmunks. Mm-hmm. They love bulbs. And they'll dig up, and I think sometimes it can kind of be confused a little bit with mole activity. You get a little mound of mulch or whatever as they try to get in to dig up those bulbs. So I wonder if that's it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest problem has been squirrels, and
or
just
squirrels.
not even eating the bulb, but just looking for a nut and digging up all the bulbs. So yeah, and there's a number of ways of discouraging those animals. I mean, they sell mesh that you can put down, like bird block. There's they sell all kinds of crazy spike things and things that you can put down over the bulbs temporarily to keep them out. So that's one way of dealing with it, with the exclusion. But yeah, I think you'd want to get a bead on what exactly is attacking those bulbs and kind of addressing it that way.
Well, Marianne, I hope we answered your question for you, or at least helped you out a little bit tonight. Let's move on to our next call. We have Joanne from Windber. Joanne, what's your question?
Hello. I have a huge cottonwood tree, and I have a Virginia creeper that has just taken over, and it's just all over the tree, up to the top. It's about 100 foot tall. I wonder if it will harm the tree.
I would say yes, that it has a potential to. I've seen Virginia creeper strangle birches and other tall trees. Now cottonwood's pretty big, but I generally don't like to see vines growing up trees that I care about. It causes deformity and it can overtake trees. I generally cut Virginia creeper. You can cut it at the base, it'll still be in the tree. I mean, obviously you're not gonna probably be pulling that out of a 100-foot tree, but I would stay on top of just every season kind of cutting it at the base and keeping it from taking over.
Okay, we have another call. Brad from Warren. Brad, how can we help you?
Yes, I was calling. I burn wood in the winter, and when I take my ashes out, I put them on my garden, and in the spring I rototill these ashes in. Now, does that help the garden, or is it hurting the garden?
Yeah, ashes are about 4% potassium. So again, if your garden needs potassium, you're helping it. The only way that you'll know if you need that potassium is with a soil test. So yeah, get your soil test, get your results back, see where your potassium is. If you need potassium, the ashes will provide that.
But a small garden, you can over time overdo that.
You can
just by
easily.
playing ash
Yeah.
deposit
Yeah.
winter after winter.
Yeah, you could easily overdo it. So that's why we recommend the soil test.
All right, and we have a tweet. User @BamLife sent us a tweet saying, "Are ladybugs harmful? I've had several swarming in my house."
It depends on your level of pain. I mean, the ladybugs are great. I think probably the ladybug she's referring to is the multicolored Asian lady beetle. Mm-hmm. It's not native here to the United States. It made its appearance many years ago. And it just has it just likes to overwinter in structures. I mean, in its native habitat, it overwinters on rock faces, cliffs, and there's not many here in Pennsylvania, so the next best thing is a house. It's getting some of that southern or western facing sun. And so they're looking for a place just like, John, you were talking about
the stink bugs.
The stink bugs.
Yeah.
They're just looking for a place to live. And so that's where the kind of the rub between, what they want to do in human activity. But they are aggressive feeders. Both the mature and the immature will feed on aphids and other pest insects, and so they are serving a role in our garden, in our landscape. But that's kind of a hard sell to someone when they're eating their cereal and they're dropping out of the light fixtures.
Yeah. Well, and I would say with the Asian lady beetles, those are actually out competing our native species.
Well, that's a good point.
A lot of our native species of ladybugs are in serious decline. So I would say don't feel bad at all about vacuuming them up or getting rid of them, because it's almost certainly going to be the invasive kind, not the native kind.
And I've talked with our entomologists about this. My wife hates ladybugs.
Who hates ladybugs?
My wife. When they're in the house.
Yeah.
And they said, well, those ones, because what I do is I pick them up and I take them outside and, see you next spring kind of thing. And they say, well, they're not going to survive. So, yeah, you can suck them up, and it's just try to look the other way.
We have a question from email. Jim writes, "I found a seed pod from milkweed growing along the road. Is there any trick to planting it in my yard?"
Yes, the only trick is to plant it now. So a lot of people think, oh, well, wildflowers, flowers, you plant them in the spring, but most of our native wildflowers that complete their annual or perennial cycle and set seed over the summer, they actually drop the seed and they're expecting it to go through a freeze-thaw cycle and get some cold, wet weather in order to break down the seed coat. So what you'd want to do is just scatter them wherever you want them to grow next year or plant them in the ground. Otherwise, you're going to have quite a hard time getting them to germinate when you try to plant them out next spring. They probably would not germinate.
So Jim, good timing on that email. Is there any trick, Justin, to where they should plant them? Is there a type of soil that milkweed likes, habitat that it likes?
I'm guessing if you found it along the roadside that it's probably going to be common milkweed, which will grow anywhere. So it really loves our clay soil. I've seen it pop up in grassy fields. So there's almost
sunny
nowhere.
Area would be
sunny
preferable.
area. Yes, absolutely. It can take some partial shade, but yeah, definitely a sunny area. But in terms of soil types or other conditions, nothing too special.
Okay, we have another phone call. Aaron from Lewistown. Aaron, what's your question?
Hi, I live in the old part of Lewistown where there's tall buildings, no sunlight really hits it, and my landlord brought him a device from the Penn State Extension. It's for what do you call it? The compost device, and I've been putting things into it, and nothing's really turning out. With soil, it's just nothing's happening, and I'm not sure I'm doing wrong, or is there anything I can do without using, say, brute force? Any advice on that?
So Aaron, you're talking about it's a composting bin and you're putting material in the bin and it's not breaking down. Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, to make a good compost, there is kind of a little bit of a formula as far as the amount of what we call browns and greens. You might want to call or talk to your local extension office and see if they don't have a little flyer on how to make a good compost. The other thing is that those bins, and I've got one myself that we gave out, they're very small, and I've not had good luck with getting them to heat and work very quickly. They do work, but they work slowly. The more you turn it, and if you can keep it moist, that's going to help your composting process.
Yeah, there's a lot involved in there. I mean, there's turning, there's adding moisture, there's adding, kitchen waste.
Making sure it has enough airflow.
Airflow. So I mean, it's like a recipe.
Yeah.
And the mix of what you're putting into it has a lot to do with that too. Yeah.
And we have a question from email. John writes, and this is probably a common question out there: why haven't the colors of the fall foliage been as brilliant, as former years? Anyone want to tackle that one?
I think that's a hard one to tackle because it's going to be hyper-local and it's going to be depending on how good your memory is. So this is a frequent argument amongst some friends of mine, which is, oh, the fall is so much earlier this year or later, or more brilliant or less brilliant. But I will say, I think having this, long dry spell, we had 3 weeks of very little rain, hot temperatures, just as the plants were starting to go dormant and starting to turn, I think really stressed them out. So I know like the Fothergilla that I have in my yard, which is normally brilliant red, really gorgeous, it just went to brown and just said, forget it, we'll see you next year. So I think, weather definitely does play a role, and we had a lot of rain, then we had a lot of dry. So I think that makes for not as brilliant fall color.
But there are some trees out there that still has some nice color. I think makes you appreciate it a little more.
Yeah.
Some of the hickories, nice yellow. Some of the maples are showing some nice red.
Dogwoods are still beautiful.
So
I have some sassafras that are
yeah, sassafras looks good. So I mean, so you may have to look a little more careful and make you appreciate it a little more. But there's some color out there.
Enjoy it. It's out there. I saw some today. So, what about when those leaves? They're all going to fall. Is there something people should be doing to the leaves other than just bagging them up? Do you recommend keeping them on the lawn or keeping them for the garden for the next year? Is there something that people can they put those leaves to use moving forward?
I think there's a lot of uses with leaves. It is good to leave some behind just so they can decompose in that area, but I use them in my garden as a mulch. So I'll gather them up when they're dry in the fall because they're easy to gather then. It's a little difficult when it's, after winter, things are kind of soggy and wet. But gather them up, and then I use them as a mulch to, you were talking about the weeds earlier, use it as a mulch to save moisture, but also inhibit some weed growth.
Yeah.
You said before about some things that we can do now to help with problems next year. One of the things we really encourage people with apple trees, a lot of the number one disease with apples, the foliar disease, is apple scab, and that lives on the leaves. From this year, that'll live on the leaves over the winter, and then the spores will develop when the temperature and the moisture conditions are right next spring. If we can rake those up and get them out of there, you put them in your compost bin, put them in your vegetable garden, get them away from the orchard area, that goes a long way towards reducing the spores and the disease for next year.
Okay. We have one more question. Nick from Central City. Nick.
Hello. I have a question about parsley. I've been growing it for many years. The past 2 years, the parsley has gone to seed the first year instead of the second year. I was wondering why.
I've never grown parsley, so John, I'm going to punt this one to you.
That's something, if we could get your information, we can look up, but I don't know.
Well, I've had that happen before. I love growing parsley.
Okay, well there you go.
and it's bolting, so basically like a salad green. Now parsley's a biennial, so it's not supposed to go to seed. as you're saying, until the following year. But if you have the wrong weather, so if you plant it too early and it's cold and it's wet and then it warms up really quickly, it'll bolt the first year because it'll be confused. So it could just be bad luck. I try to wait and plant it pretty late in the season, so I don't put parsley out actually until June because I want it late in the season anyway. So that might be one way of avoiding that.
Okay, and we have an email from Patty. Patty writes, I live in the woods of southern Bedford County. This year I have been finding a white fungus-like spore growing on the lower inches of my wood siding on the northern side. What will be the best way to rid my siding of this? I have dogs and cats that will be exposed to this. I have thought of hydrogen peroxide or alcohol. Please give me your thoughts. Does that ring any bells?
Lichen?
I mean, that's something it could be. I don't know of any specific problem spores or funguses out there right now.
White fungus-like spore. You know, we've seen on siding, light-colored siding, a black fungus spore,
right?
The artillery fungus, but white. I'm not real familiar with a spore. If Patty can
send us a picture, Patty.
Yeah, that'd
we'll
be a
get
good
it to
idea
the
if we
right
can do
place.
that.
We'll try
Yeah.
to get your question answered. Probably not tonight. Eventually.
Might be a good opportunity to power wash the siding, but
yeah. So we have about 10 minutes left in the show. What about lawn care? When should you stop mowing your lawn? Does anybody work in this area? Just let the grass grow. What's best for your lawn heading into winter?
Yeah, so you know, here in Pennsylvania, mostly what we grow are cool season grasses. So they thrive in the spring and the fall. And when we get into that typical hot summer weather, they go somewhat dormant and usually brown out. I didn't see a lawn brown out this year.
No.
I mean, with all the moisture we had and the holding capacity of that soil, that grass was actively growing. And as Justin, you said, it was kind of a cool growing season, so that was really good for our turf. And you know, talking to a couple landscapers, they've been mowing the whole season through. So you're not going to see anything change until we get into these really cool, cold temperatures. You do want to make sure that your grass is not super long going into the winter, because it will tend to flop over, and you can get things like pink snow mold and some other issues. So I'm not saying you have to scalp your lawn, but you want to go into winter with your lawn cut. And then the other thing, it's getting kind of late now, but fall is a good time for fertilizing your lawns if you're into fertilizing lawns. You don't want to be fertilizing in the middle of the summer, because you might run into a warm spell and it's just, things aren't growing right. So.
Right, but with that you have to time it just right, because if you wait too long and the lawn goes dormant, then you're putting fertilizer on the lawn that's not going to get taken up, and then it's just going to wash into our watershed. So there is a window for it, and I don't know if our window's quite closed yet, but you do want to be cognizant of that.
Okay, it's all about timing. We have another phone call. Carlos from Morrisdale. Carlos, what's your question?
Hi, I have a few Japanese maple trees, and actually on one of the trees, we got a lot of, I think they're like stinky bugs. They're kind of armor-shaped, dark bugs, and my question was, why did they just get on the one tree and not on both trees that I have? They're right next to each other, so I don't understand what happened there. They just ate through the leaves as much as they could, and I peeled hundreds off, and I couldn't stop them. Is there anything that I could do to prevent that next year? This is the second year it's happened.
So Carlos, this is occurring now, or this occurred earlier in the summer?
It occurred earlier in the summer.
So it's probably Japanese beetles is probably what you were. So, you know, when Japanese beetles first come into an area, there's a handful that come into an area, and if they find something that's kind of tasty or appetizing, they give off on a pheromone, and it's an attractant pheromone. So it could be that they landed on that maple tree first. It had a kind of a unique characteristic compared to the other one, and it just seemed somewhat more attractive, and they drew the rest of their cohorts into that little neighborhood around that tree and started feeding on that tree. So it's kind of the same concept with those Japanese beetle traps. You know, we use a pheromone, in that instance a sex pheromone, to try to attract them into that area or into that trap. But they're using an attractant pheromone. But that's about the only thing I can think of, is that they landed there first and find it tasty.
Yeah, I've seen them go up to a field of hollyhocks, and they will choose one hollyhock and just totally decimate that one. So it seems like, yeah, when they find something they like to eat, they go after it. It's hopefully unlikely that they'll come back to the same tree next year. So any damage they did this year is just going to be cosmetic, but it's still annoying for sure.
So we're almost out of time. I'd like to get some of your final thoughts, maybe some final advice for viewers here today. So no snow yet, no really hard freezes. Anything that you would advise our viewers tonight? What can they do? What shouldn't they do moving ahead into winter?
I'm going to stick with the Halloween theme. So you go around the neighborhoods and everyone's got pumpkins on their porches. And, a lot of people will buy lots of pumpkins, and that can be kind of expensive. So I maybe look through the garden catalogs this winter and look for some species of some pumpkins, different sizes, shapes, and colors, and plant them in the garden for next Halloween.
John, quickly.
Okay, I've mentioned several times soil testing, great time of the year to get that done. Be prepared for next year. You can apply your lime, have everything set up for success for next year.
And Justin?
Yeah, I would say this is the best time of year to plant trees and shrubs. Plant them when they're dormant. It's going to be less stress on them. Just make sure that they're well watered and well mulched until we get that first really hard freeze.
Sounds good. Guys, thank you very much. I'd like to thank tonight's guests, Penn State Extension educators Tom Butzler and John Elsinger, also Master Gardener Justin Wheeler. I'm Bill Hallman. For all of us here at WPSU, thank you for joining us. Good night.